Okay, so welcome everybody. Tonight we're going to talk to John Vervaeke and Christopher Mastropietro, who are kind of old friends of mine. We haven't spoken for a long time. We've had several dialogues in the past, and there was some of the most wonderful conversations I've had. So I'm really thrilled to be talking to them again. John is a professor at the University of Toronto, and for many, he probably needs no introduction. He's invented this word, the meaning crisis, or this neologism, which everyone is using, and he seems to have this knack of inventing vocabularies which enter into all of our into our vocabularies. So many of the things that we've been talking about have been based in some of John's ideas, like dialogos and other things. John, we have this weekly group, and we've been talking about the meaning crisis for the past month, and we've been concerned with religion. That's our topic for tonight: religious psychotechnologies. And also Chris is another guy who, we've had trialogues before, and I've also had podcasts with Chris. He's John's writing partner. He's author of this book about zombies. We did actually class on zombies and monsters also. So again, you're already a big presence here. And Chris is, Chris has an amazing mind and is an amazing thinker and philosopher, and I especially appreciate the way his insights and his use of language, and I think you'll get a flavor for that as we begin our discussion here. So what I want to ask you guys about, and what's really been on my mind and what we've been talking about, is this in-between world space, which is Zach Stein's expression, which you've called the meaning crisis. And we know that there's opportunity in crisis, and we know that there's also a lot of chaos. And I wanted to talk about that from the point of view of religion, because what I'm seeing is that some people are going back into traditionalism, and other people are going to, atheism and stuff. And then there's this in-between space of people who cannot really go back to the traditional religious world. And they also can't abide this materialistic reductionist view of the world, and they're looking for something in between. So that's what I kind of want to riff with you guys about. Maybe I could start with you, John.
I guess the proposal I want to make is the in-between people are the people best fitted for this in-between time. That's sort of at the crux, and that giving them a place and a way of talking and connecting and communing with each other and articulating the most appropriate family of responses to the meaning crisis is at the core of what I'm trying to do. Trying to understand what this is, what this in-betweenness is, what it discloses about reality, and also trying to afford its development as a response to the meaning crisis. That's the core of what I'm trying to do. I've said it before, and I'll say it again here. If people can return to one of the traditional world religions and find a home in which individually and collectively they can cultivate wisdom and virtue and an ability to love being again, and to the virtue and virtuosity of pursuing the true and the good and the beautiful, go ahead. That's great. And one of the things that's been a surprise to me, but also a joy to me, is many religious people have said this to me, that the work has done that for them. And that is great. Many people, though, also say to me, I share with you that I can't go back. The going back is not an option, but I can't just stay in the sort of standard mainstream worldview, because it's killing me, either figuratively or sometimes almost literally, with suicide and such. And that demographic is growing, and I want everything I do is now increasingly being woven towards trying to this sounds pretentious by false modesty, but it's not. I want to serve that demographic as much as I possibly can. So, I mean, there's two tasks at least, and Chris is often involved with both of these tasks with me, but it's trying to get clear to make sense of what's happening right now, which means really getting deeply into the nuts and bolts of our capacity to make sense and the kind of worldview that that is potentially emerging, and to try and get them articulated and the relationship between them properly articulated. And then, like I said, to try and transform that articulation into proper aspiration for both individuals and communities of communities. So I'll just now let Chris respond. I think you're muted, Chris.
You're muted, Chris.
Thank you. Sorry about that. One thing I might add is to say that the in-between state and the people who find themselves particularly who find their humors particularly characterized by that in-between state, that's a place of a certain kind of suffering. It's very difficult to measure and to measure out. And because it's very difficult to measure out, it's very difficult to respond to. I often think that it presents as a kind of existential ambivalence toward one's own being, and not knowing how to muster a person's will in response to the imperative to live well. And I think one of the problems is that the imperative to live well is so strong, it appears as a kind of drive, almost as a kind of as a moral requirement to being oneself. And yet, the problem, I think, for so many people is that there's no symbol left that galvanizes all of the disparate elements of life and coheres them around a common center, right? That idea or thought by which I can live and die. So many people are searching for that idea, not idea in a propositional, calculated or dispassionate way, but that form of life that can galvanize all of those elements and bring them into a final order. And to have that final order present as a path that leads a person down a particular course. And I think for those people, the nuns is one way of describing them that's kind of risen as a neologism, is that they sort of suffer from a problem of a second order will, right? They want to be religious, but they can't do it, right? It's a profoundly unnerving feeling. And it leaves one in a state of spiritlessness, right? Almost as though one can't, like a plane built for flight that can't get off the ground, right? It's something, it presents as a problem of the atmosphere of the world itself, but its locus is also within. And because of that, we can't find the source of the problem, because it seems to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And that lack of correspondence between what I want or want to will and what I can find it in me to do, that gap is a profoundly, profoundly destructive gap. And I think it leads us into all kinds of, it leads us right upon a precipice. I mean, Jung has a
maybe into nihilism, no?
Right. That's right. Well, I'm thinking of people like Jung and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, all of whom had variants of this insight, which is that the modern person stands upon the brink, right, upon a precipice, and looks off where looks into a kind of a land's end, and the responsibility that comes with that position and that station, and the horror and anxiety that comes with that sort of abyssal experience is more than we have training to meet. And I think that the failure of that training, the failure of the symbolic grammar, the failure of the institutional coherence that once gave us a prescriptive language for what to do, the loss of all of these things. I mean, one of John's founding insights in The Meaning Crisis is that these perennial issues that we have, that we are susceptible to things like anxiety and alienation and absurdity and despair, the perennial problem of despair, are exacerbated by historical circumstances where once we had a canopy to enclose a kind of correspondence with with being and with the world, that canopy having fallen, we no longer find ourselves stoked in the way we were, right? So it's a compounding problem comprised of both perennial and historical elements.
So great. Go ahead, John. Yeah.
I just want to pick up on one thing Chris said, because again, his lyrical insight is just amazing. That ambivalence cannot be resolved by the locus of it is sort of at the level of the will in the Kierkegaardian sense, but it can't be solved by willing in a Cartesian sense, in the political sense of will. Like I can't just assert my way out of this problem. We can't just make policy that we will all assert together as our way out of this problem. So while it is at that locus, I perhaps might want to use the word heart, not meaning an emotional center, but like the heart of the matter. It's at the level of the heart of our being. This is not a place, it's the places from which our choice is made, but it's not a place that is made by our choices, if I could put it that way, right? And we have to get to that place, and we precisely are not getting to it because we're confusing cause and effect. We're thinking if we just have more choice and we make more choices, somehow that will get us to that place from which choices emerge, which is exactly the wrong way to go. And this is a perennial point made by many wisdom traditions, and of course by Kierkegaard himself. Like the final salvation by Christ is not an act of will, right? In the sense of assertion, it is to give over that space in a proper way. So this is the religious dimension of this problem, right? It's a trying not to try, a willing not to will. It's this paradoxical place we have to get to, that religion had a set of practices for us to get into, that we need to get to. I'm making the in-between even more in-between, if you'll allow me. I'm saying that the in-between borders on in the superlative sense, not in the privative sense. It borders on the paradoxical. We are trying to get at, like I said, we're trying to get at the place from which choices are come, but it is not something that we get to by choosing. And that is the properly religious aspect of how to address this ambivalence. And that is bound up with the in-betweenness in a profound way. I just wanted to get that out there.
That's very interesting. Well, maybe if I could just speak a little bit about this group and personally to try to tie that in. What we've been doing here is we've been trying to in a sense, have an educational platform, and where we discuss these things, and we discuss the things that can't be spoken of elsewhere, right? Like in universities, like we're talking about religion, which you don't do in a university class usually, unless it's sort of in a divinity department or whatever. So while there's this crisis going on, it seems like there's all of there's a movement in the other direction as well. Maybe we need to explore the crisis a little bit more before we talk about this other movement. But can you speak to that? Because that's what I'm seeing. And
you mean the meaning crisis? Is that the?
Well, there's a meaning crisis, and then there's this construction of meaning that we're all doing, sort of spontaneously and outside of the traditional forms of doing that.
Yes, and that's exactly that was exactly what I was trying to put my finger on in my last comment, that we can misframe the project of trying to reappropriate the heart of meaning making as the act of willing or choosing. The choosing of propositions, the choosing of a side, the choosing of a tribe, the choosing of a team. We can make that fundamental mistaking and misapprehension and misframing of what needs to be done. We don't get into the heart of our sense making by remaining at that level. That's why I talk about all the kinds of knowing and about these levels of being that we have. And so part of what the meaning crisis has done is numbed us. And we've become numb and dumb in the classical meaning of the word dumb, right? We've become numb and dumb about these other levels of our being and of being in general. And that means we are trapped at a place where we are trying exactly the wrong thing in our meaning making in order to address the issue that is facing us.
Not to mention the fact that the demands of this sort of spiritual thirst that I think runs as a current through probably many people here today, and runs through as a current in these emergent kind of subcultures, like the dialogic culture that we've all participated in here, is an attempt to escape institutions that have ossified so much that they no longer have the elasticity and that kind of respiratory quality that the spirit requires in order to be properly sated and properly stimulated, right? Like John said, you're not going to create policy for meaning because it's not simply, or it's not exclusively propositional. So you're not going to somehow encode it formally in such a way that it can be digested within a lot of the axioms that we work within our culture, right? I think that's become particularly obvious over the last couple of years of COVID, right? When everyone's looking for wisdom from officials and authorities, and it's no wonder that they don't have it, right? Because there's no, I mean, you know, for people who still can retrieve that from the church, then that's obviously that's the source of it. But for many people who can't, or who aren't in the position to retrieve that kind of wisdom from traditional religious institutions, then there's a paucity of such places where you would go to find perspective, like real perspective, the kind of perspective that would make sense of a dilemma such that you could act upon it and be content with the degree of indeterminacy and resolve that sense of equivocation and ambivalence, right? There's this problem of decision, and you see it playing out everywhere, right? We can't decide, we can't agree on what to do. We can't accord to a particular course, a way of being and acting and responding. And it's ever more fragmented and ever more conflicted because of that, because there's no common center of wisdom to gather to, like a flame.
So my question here is that, you know, I was thinking as you were speaking of the wisdom traditions, you know, in India, you know, on the Silk Route, and at one point where there would be many, many different schools of many, many different religions, all kind of gathered together, and they could make decisions because there was such a diversity of, and, you know, maybe they would argue, but there was certain kind of harmony in the chaos of it all, and also an intimacy between people, so that decisions could be made in a real heart kind of way, instead of decisions being made the way they are today, you know, in this abstract scientific or scientistic, I should say, not scientific manner. So you know, I guess my question is this what's kind of happening? Are we going to rediscover the non-dual wisdom schools while we're doing this? Maybe they don't have to be theistic. Maybe some of them are theistic, some of them aren't. Maybe there'll be a whole, this is what I'm imagining anyway, a whole series of tribes of people, you know, reacting to the meaning crisis, and, you know, as because everybody knows, you know, it's like that Leonard Cohen song. Everybody knows that it's so corrupt that it's, you can't breathe there, as you say. There's no, doesn't breathe. So can you make anything out of that? My comments?
Yeah, I can, and I like the Silk Road. I would have loved to have lived in Bactria, where you know, Platonic philosophers and Buddhists and Vedantists were all intermingling.
Yes.
That would have, I think I would have found a happy home there. I guess I want to, in saying that, I want to say what it's not. It's not a nostalgic return. We can't go back. I mean, I was just talking to Sevilla King, and I was making a claim about we can't go back to Neoplatonism any more than we can go back to shamanism. What we need is we need a reciprocal reconstruction. Science and Neoplatonism have to reciprocally reconstruct each other, the way, you know, Neoplatonism and Christianity reciprocally reconstructed each other. For example, we have the way Islam and Neoplatonism reciprocally reconstructed each other in Sufism. But we have to do that for us, where the other of the Neoplatonism is, I put it to, is science. And they actually sit very, very much closer together
Then we would think, yeah, sure.
than we
Yeah.
would think.
Mhm.
And so that I'm not proposing a fantastical a possibility. I'm proposing a real possibility. But I want to really clearly state that what we're talking about is neither a nostalgic proposal or a utopic proposal, right? And so I don't mind hearing the word non-dual as it's used as an adjective rather than as a noun. What I mean by that is I don't think sort of traditional discourse around non-duality, and I'm using Neoplatonism as one of the classic examples from the West, is going to be sufficient for this. That's why I prefer to use the metaphor of acceptation. We have to enter into a dialogue with it, but in a good dialogue, in good dialogos, both parties are transformed, get to a place they couldn't get to on their own. We have that again in the historical examples of Neoplatonism and Christianity, Neoplatonism, Islam, Neoplatonism and Judaism. And there's a thing happening right now that's really interesting. I got a book on it where Neoplatonism and Buddhism are starting to talk to each other in this way. And I think Arthur versus Lewis is right that Neoplatonism is the spiritual grammar of the West. That's what we're going to have to use. But I think the big other for us in this particular crisis is science. Again, not scientism,
Yeah.
right? But science. The scientific worldview is deeply problematic. That's part of the problem with the meaning crisis. Yeah. We don't have a home in there, but it's also not ignorable. And Heidegger's point, that worldview is woven as a daily ontology into the technology that surrounds you and suffuses you. To pretend we can somehow step aside from science and the scientific worldview is not a viable option. So I don't think we can just go back, but I think we could learn from these.
And maybe we can't replace it with the science worldview either, right? As you say, there has to be a reciprocal thing. Like that's, we don't want to just replace one view with another view. There has to be this reciprocal creation of another view, right?
It emerges. Yes, yeah. And my hope is that dialogos can scale that way, that it can be not only between people and between communities, but between like worldviews, if I can put it that way, between Neoplatonism and science, such that we could get very much like what has happened we know that this is possible. We have clear historical, cross-contextual, cross-cultural examples that this is doable. And this is what I think we should be thinking about right now. So I don't think we can just go back, nor am I proposing a utopia. I want to propose something like this reciprocal reconstruction within dialogos that will afford us to properly appropriate the in-between and turn it into a direction, like Chris is saying, that gives us a way of being decisive without being assertive in the guts of our lives.
Yeah. Yeah, when you say the in-between, because I'm steeped in Buddhist mythopoetics, I think of the bardos, which are which are in between worlds, and that actually we're always in a bardo moment. We're always in a transition from one thing to the other, and that's the state of things. So the meaning crisis is perennial. It's not just like what's happening now, obviously, right?
That's why it's the gray life. That's why it's the gray life. Right, the
gray life, yeah,
gray life, right. The quote you used at the beginning of the zombie book was from Huxley. Not the Black Death this time; it's the gray life. And there is a distinct purgatorial there's a sort of a purgatorial ambience to that feeling, a certain colorlessness, like a monochromatic way of experiencing. Sorry
to interrupt, but the bardos are very colorful. They're just everything that's happening in an extreme. They're sort of like the acceleration of everything. I think, yeah.
But that's it. Can we give people the transformation of we are always in between. We're in the bardo between transcendence and immanence, mind and matter, subjective and objective, individual and group. Like we're always there. This is the great Socratic insight. That is humanity. Yeah. And that can either degenerate into ambivalent ambiguity, like Chris is saying, or it can rise to the level, right? It can rise to the level of self-transcendence. It can rise to the level, right, in which we realize and you have to take this word very carefully, the paradox of that we're transcendent and immanent, right? The transformation would like, if you hear the paradox is only nonsense, you have to be able to, the transformation is, you go from hearing the paradox as nonsense into hearing it as super sense. That is the kind of thing that religions allowed us to do. We have lost our hearing. And speaking those ancient propositions when we don't have the hearing will do us no good. We have to recover the hearing. We have to recover the hearing.
The stereoscopic effect of,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
The two eyes, the two ears, right? The depth perception that comes with the stereoscopy of two lines of sight merging. And I think that, John and I, we were just talking about this the other day, actually, about, one of the features of the religious, the ardently religious that we see, is that they've lost a sense of the paradoxical, right?
Yes.
And religion without paradox becomes a tyranny, because it becomes fundamentalism, it becomes literalism, right? It can't account for the simultaneous being and not being that are the constitutive features.
That's it. The being and not
experience.
being is the mystical, is the entry to the mystical dimension, I think. And that's a paradox, which is almost cannot be spoken of, right? So that's kind of the problem, right?
Yeah, but it's at the heart of reason. I'm reading deeply.
Oh, okay.
Read D.C. Schindler, his book, The Catholicity of Reason. Don't misunderstand. Catholicity means oriented towards the whole. And you can either, in Levinas, you can either understand the whole as an infinity or as a totality. And Levinas's point is, when you think of it as a totality, then that leads to totalitarianism. And infinity has within it the idea of perpetual self-transcendence. And self-transcendence is at the heart of rationality. We've thought we've reduced rationality to sort of formal totalitarian logic. We've got this formal system but we know that's impossible. Gödel, no such system can be complete and consistent, right? Reason is inherently self-transcending. It's what allows you to move from one logic to another, from one narrative to another, from one symbol to another, right? And it's inherently, in that sense, self-transcendence is at the heart. If you are engaging in any act of self-correction, which I would posit is the core of rationality, you are involved in self-transcendence, and you are involved in that sense in a paradox. Because whenever I'm transcending myself, I'm somehow becoming other than myself while remaining myself. And that, for me, that's the guts of what Kierkegaard and what Socrates were on about. And we can't hear that anymore. And Chris is right. Not only do we not hear it in the secular world, it's getting hard to hear it within the religious world.
Yeah. Well, I was talking with this, he's kind of a Jewish mystic who studied Dzogchen a lot, and he has a sort of non-theistic point of view, and he works with all of this, but he works with all of the traditional kind of imagery and symbolism in a non-theistic way, in a much more flexible way, rather than in a narrative way. I don't know how to explain it, but he was telling me that he was thinking that in the future that actually the atheists will be mystics, that reason could actually lead people, if people used reason and took it to its furthest possible extent, then they'll get to non-duality, or they'll get to that point of view, which I thought was
properly described the Neoplatonic project. That's Neoplatonism in a province. That's what it is. That's exactly what it is. And so the difference between the mystical and the rational completely disappears without either one being subsumed or destroyed in the other. That is the Neoplatonic grammar. But again, we can't simply nostalgically go back to it, nor can we utopically just say everybody needs to become a Neoplatonist. Both of those propositionals are ridiculous and must be avoided.
Yeah. It seems to me there's a creativity that is necessary, but it's not a kind of a self-creativity, or it's something other than just how we usually think of creativity, meaning self-expression. It's this other kind of creativity that will bring this into fruition.
Yeah, and well, it's almost like it's creativity, and I think in its sacrifice altogether. The one thing that I can't get past is that there's a sacrificial, and this harkens to a Christian worldview to some degree, and that's fine. That's, I think, appropriate to some degree. But there's a sacrificial element to all of this. There's a giving up. I mean, even in the Christian existential tradition, right? There's a giving up of oneself in order to gain oneself, right? And that arguably finds its roots in the Neoplatonists as well, right? Pseudo Dionysius, for instance, right? Where, right, is not I who lives, right? His correspondence back to Paul, right? It is not I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And that's why the use of the pseudonymous entity for him is a way of negating himself in order to gain ingress to a form of participation with being where his full self dwells, properly known, right? And that's the concept of the divine double, that myself persists beyond myself, right? And so the giving up of myself, it's exactly what you said, John, right? You become other than yourself in order to become yourself, right? It's a very Heraclitan paradox too, right? The river changes so that it can remain the same in some sense, right? And that but that involves a form of sacrifice, and that sacrifice involves a certain gauntlet of suffering, and it's very difficult to know how to manage that, and to have proper instruction for it is a great demand that is not met.
Because we have to enter the fire, right? Because it's always described as a fire, the mystic, experience. It's the burning bush or something, right? So he says, I am, or I will be what I will be, and he meets the burning bush. And in a sense, I think the non-dual view is beyond that, because you are making that sacrifice. So God doesn't have, God doesn't need to, God is that fire, and you go into that fire, or something like that. I hope I'm being clear here.
Well, I think the epiphany, the theophany to Moses is appropriate here, but and remember, Moses' response is, "Who am I? Who am I?" Right? The proper response is the Socratic Kierkegaardian question, "Who am I?" But I want to make clear that the issue isn't just the distress and the loss of agency in suffering, right? In sacrifice, sorry, not in suffering, but in suffering a sacrifice. That's the proper way of putting it, of undergoing it. It's also the fact that we are also culturally, we run the risk of misappropriating it. So there's a sort of historical progression of that notion, through sort of Luther and Calvin, right? But also you can see it presaged in some.
You mean it could become some kind of masochism instead of
self-flagellation,
what Gurdjieff calls conscious suffering, which is close to joy as well. I mean, or.
Well, the point I want to make is that we can hear sacrifice as, right, as self-flagellation, self-destruction, mental self-destruction through endless guilt, right? Yes. So we get the problem we face is not merely the absence of these things. We also face the degenerate surrogate of these things, is what I'm trying to say. It's not just that there's a hole, which there is. It's often that this hole is filled with degenerate surrogates that block access to the space we need to be in. That's what I'm trying to say. So it's not just that we've lost, as Chris has said, and I'm not disagreeing, not just that we've lost the sense of sacrifice. It is blocked by degenerate surrogates that mask it to us in an important way.
Yeah. We've also managed to contrive so many diversions for ourselves, right? We've put so much noise in our ears to try and block out the potency of the silence that impresses the need for those kinds of sacrifices, that it's very difficult even to get their measure in the first place, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of a super surrogacy, right? All right, where we're not even putting in an ersatz double. We're just deadening, right?
Displacing it.
So what would be right sacrifice then? I was thinking of the Jews, and they used to sacrifice a lamb in front of them or something in front of the temple, but then they started to use letters instead of animals, so that they didn't have to harm a being. But that's also by using these incantations or expressions of life energy, we're sacrificing our life energy to, I would call the divine or something like that.
Well, one of the sacrifices, I think, and it's a very basic, it's a rite of maturity to some degree, but it comes to people at different times and in different ways, is the sacrificing of possibility for the necessity of a specific course, right? For the necessity of whether it be a specific call or a specific task or even a specific vocation for those who are perhaps lucky enough for that to come out clear. Because I mean, this is Hans' point, right? You talk about this a lot, John, right? Our relationship to time has also been corrupted to some degree, right? Time isn't a thoroughfare that leads us unto eternity anymore as it once seemed, right? Time whizzes and varies and diverges, and there's a tension, there's a certain slackening of attention. And so one of the problems that we face is that we are often unwilling or unable to sacrifice possibility for the specificity of becoming a specific kind of person in a specific kind of time, because everything seems otherwise so open-ended and unbridled, right? So that it's
so there's
almost
no
like
path.
there's no path because suddenly time doesn't lead anywhere anymore, right? Time has slackened, and because of that, it can't be coiled back up into a kind of focus or into a kind of singular attention, because a lot of this is a problem of attention and where to put it, right? And if there's no tension that forces it to focus,
I hate to interrupt you, but I think you just said something really important, that is the issue, is like where we place our attention. I interrupted you and you were saying something great, so excuse me.
Well, let's pause on that. I think let's pause on that.
But the question of attention is the big question, isn't it? It's like, where do we place our attention? And that relates to our question of psychotechnologies and everything else, right?
But well, I want to go back to that and see, like, I think Chris is right. We have to be able to sacrifice possibility for actuality. We also have to be able to do the other. We have to be able to sacrifice the actual to reopen up possibilities that are needed.
Oh, right, yeah.
Right, and attention is constantly doing both of those. Your attention is constantly trying to open up possibilities and move you away from what's focal. And it's also trying to take you away from the peripheral and bring you back to the focal. And it's constantly doing this, right? And you're sacrificing the actual for the potential and the potential for the actual. This is at the core of what I call relevance realization.
And you have to break up the reified forms that you get stuck in, right?
Right, but you also have to let the forms take shape, or else you drift as a Peter Pan forever, ever, and never land. Listen to the bloody name of the place, by the way, right? Never, right? Neverland. I don't want to live there. And that's the point, right? You have to grasp your shadow in actuality. You can't just stay in the golden hue of possibility. But at times also, like you said, right? You get reified and you get locked, and you have to willing to sacrifice. So, you get the opposite metaphor. You get Luke Skywalker. You have to his home is sacrificed so that that forces him out into the wider world. You have to do that too, right? And that sacred is constantly getting us to play one off against the other so that we get the abundant life that Christ promised, or we get the enlightenment that the Buddha promised. And so sacrifice, it's like, I'm trying to get at that it's this dynamic that we have to participate in. It's not just this giving up this or giving up that. Sorry, I'm just trying to get to.
Well, I could bring in more Buddhist stuff here, because in the Hinayana is renunciation, where you give up stuff, and that's and you take the narrow path, right? That's the Hinayana, and the Mahayana, you realize that the narrow path is not good enough. We have to go into the open path, where you have to love all beings and help people, and you have an altruistic motivation, and you cultivate wisdom, and then in the Vajrayana, the third vehicle path, it's about you take those intense energies and you work with them in a creative manner, so and accept them just as they are. So that's almost like the post narrative part.
Yes.
Because you speak, I know you've been speaking to Jonathan about narrative and post narrative, sensibilities,
That's
and those
exactly
two
right.
working together, right? Is that
Yeah,
what we're talking about? Yeah.
exactly. Jesus's use of the parable in which the narrative overcomes itself, right? It's parable is a narrative sacrificing itself, but you can't think of it as a linear movement. You have to move to the non-narrative place from which narrative can emerge, but then you return back to it's right. You do this, right? You do this.
Always, yeah.
Right. The parables are like you're in a narrative and it pushes you out into the non-narrative, or the koan, you're in a question and it pushes you into the space from which questions emerge, right? The great doubt, which is no kind of question, but you don't stay there, right? Right. The point is to then that impregnates the narrative, that impregnates the questions. You come back, but you have to be willing to sacrifice in both directions on an ongoing basis. And I think that's at the core of a lot of these wisdom traditions. The point I'm making is, right, the overall point is we have to recover that for us in this in-between place within a scientific technological worldview. Simply trying to recover those practices is insufficient. I think they should properly be treated with reverence as.
But they're already dead in a sense if they're not moving through evolution of some sort, or
right. But they can take us. They can be like what Tolkien said about fantasy literature, and he meant it complimentary. They can be a place we can go to, not because we can live there, so that we can come back here and recover the world. We can see it anew, like when an anthropologist goes to another culture, goes through culture shock, and then comes back here to see and understand their own culture better. That recovery, right? We can't recover the past, but we can recover through the past the present. That's what I think Chris and I are proposing.
And it's the same, the exact dynamic that you just described between the narrative and the supranarrative is the same. It maps, it's coterminous to the relationship between the temporal and the eternal, right?
Yes,
that's its function.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
And so that you re-impregnate the experience of the temporal with the experience of the eternal, right? And that suffuses it with the tension and the meaningfulness and the sense of direction that makes it a vessel for attention. But it's that cyclical right of return in the same way, I think.
So one of my hopes is that we already have emerging ecologies of practices, and there's a project, and I'm participating in it, of trying to get these various ecologies to network together and to help scale dialogos from interpersonal up to intercommunal up to interworldview. And however that's going to unfold, it has to unfold of itself, or it's not the logos. It's not doing what we're talking about here.
That's a very important point, right? Because if you try to construct something in a utopian manner, it's doomed to be counterproductive. And
I want on my gravestone neither nostalgia nor utopia. That's what I want on my gravestone. That's what we need to get, because we are perennially tempted to both of those.
Right. Yeah. So I'm kind of like wondering though, but how you can do that, without a tradition. Like, this is always my question. I mean, it's always my question is how that can emerge without a tradition. I acknowledge that there's a post-traditional space, and there should be, but I wonder how you can do that without going through the tradition. Because even when we're doing it without the tradition, we're bringing in all these religious metaphors, like you and Jordan were talking about the Exodus the other day.
But that's what we should be doing. That's what
we should be doing. Yeah.
The dialogos between science and Neoplatonism, right? Which is trying to emerge something between them that's beyond them and beneath them, right? So I want to be in deep, and I practice this. I'm not just saying this. I want to be in deep dialogos with people who are in these traditions, right? Deep dialogos with Christians and with Jews and with Muslims and with Buddhists and with, anybody who comes to me with a vitality and a vibrancy from their participation in one of the traditions. I want to enter into good faith dialogos with them.
Yeah. And if this isn't too personal a question, do you feel that tension about not being able to join one particular tradition and just work with that and taking from so many different areas? Do you feel that that's, I'm not saying that's a problem, and I'm not criticizing you.
No.
I'm just wondering if that in between place is sustainable for
well, Chris and I this is one of the places where we differ, but in a very loving manner, but because we're not homogenous. We're at different, we're facing different projects in different ways, and we try to help each other from that difference rather than rail at each other from that difference. And it's one of the ways in which we express our deep philia for each other. For me, I've given up in the sense of the breath of release when you finally realize that you're over someone. There was a bad relationship and you're finally over.
Okay.
That's what it feels like to me. I've got to find the home. I've got to find. And then I finally realized, no, that's not me. In some fundamental way. And this is a way in which I deeply identify with Socrates. Socrates wasn't at home anywhere. And not to be in any way arrogant or identifying, that's how Jesus described himself.
Yeah, and that's the meaning of Buddhist refuge, is you make a vow to be homeless.
And that's what Jordan and I were trying to talk about being passers-by. One of these great pronouncements that you get in Buddhism and from Jesus, right? Be passers-by, to accept this, right? So
So what's the difference here? I'm curious, because I've never heard you guys have converging views on anything. So
one of the things is also, I mean, there's deep differences, and because we're different people. But the other is, I just turned 60.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
I didn't mean to say that you don't. I mean, I haven't. I didn't mean to say that you don't.
No. I didn't think you were.
You don't have your own minds or anything.
But I'm 60, and the temporal horizon for me has flipped.
Yes.
Right. And Chris is much younger than me, and I'm not saying that it's the sole source of the difference by any means, but that's a real difference as well. And so. And for that very reason, I would not want to. I think it would be a sin on my part to try and impose where I'm at on Chris in any way. All I want to do is be an other to him through which he can transcend himself as he needs to.
So are you able to speak on that, Chris, or on your search or whatever?
Yeah, sure.
He's talking about.
I mean, John and I overlap, even though we differ. So, I mean, I shared John's sense of homelessness. That's definitely a perennial feature of my relationship to religion is as an outsider. I mean, I grew up within the Christian tradition, but I grew up within it in a very different way than John did. I don't think you'll mind me saying that, John.
No, go ahead, please, Chris.
Whereas John's relationship with Christianity, I mean, John had to suffer a very inimical, I think, form of it, and I didn't. I mean, my relationship with it was ambivalent. There was a great deal of it that ceded vitality to me, but there was also a lot of it that was confounded, and there was a lot of it that was intellectually dissatisfying. And yet underneath the intellectual dissatisfaction, there's a sediment there that I can't be rid of, even if I want to, or at least not at this point in my life. I feel about Christianity, for instance, the way I feel about myself in the Kierkegaardian way, which is like, I'm stuck with it. I can't be rid of it, but I can't completely step into it and become it either. Right. I'm quite beside it, and it's quite beside me. There's a being with relationship there. And there's a tension. And I think that's how a lot of people feel about it, is that they can't quite do away with it. They can't dispel it from their souls, because you can't do that. You can't just will something away from you or will yourself out of something.
You have to go through it maybe rather than around it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That the constitutive relationship is reversed, right? I've come out of it. It hasn't come out of me. And so how can I do away with it? At the same time, that symbol, I mean, that's one of the reasons I find the symbolic grammar and symbolic thinking so fascinating, because at the same time, there's a certain kind of symbolic aspiration that I find very difficult to access, right? And so it's a perennial tension. How
what do
it
you
will
mean
resolve
a
is
symbolic
anyone's guess.
aspiration that you find hard to access? I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, what a symbol does is it intervenes. It's a profound kind of intervention in your phenomenology, right? The way the world presents to you, the way it aspectually appears and seems to envelop you, but also ontologically, in terms of, right, what's constitutive of being, what feels real fundamentally, and what beckons you to that aspect of yourself that remains submerged in the mysterious and in the unconscious, right? What the symbol does is it conveys that which is ineffable, that which cannot be formulated in any kind of propositional way, right? The symbol exceeds the frame of perspective always, but it straddles the frame of perspective, right? That's why it's the symbolon, the bridge, right? What is outside and what is within, what is beyond and what is immanent, right?
The symbol is
and
a bridge. Yeah.
That's right. And so because of that, the symbol has a profound capacity to intervene and to rearrange and to redirect. We talked about the problem with attention. The beauty of a symbol, and I don't mean beauty in just a kind of sensuous way or just in an aesthetic way. I mean beauty in its full conveyance and connotation, has the capacity to intervene in a cycle of self-concept and open it outwards and open it inwards. That's what a symbol does and can do, right? The symbol is a cosmos contained within an aspect that opens us while opening itself. And so that's the great endowment traditionally that I still find very hard to access in my own religious tradition, even though I know other people do access it. And I'm struck by the beauty of that when I see it, and I do. And it's enough for me vicariously to understand that such things are still possible for people, but there are a great many people for whom it comes with a great struggle, and perhaps necessarily.
I wonder if that has to do with the difference. Like, all of us are kind of unconscious Christians, even if we're not Christians, you know, in the sense that we're living through Christian symbolism, whether we like it or not. It's like, but at the same time, I guess a Christian, what would define a Christian is somebody that works with those symbols directly, in a conscious way. Because I mean, I know that in the Vajrayana, there's part of Vajrayana is called the deity yoga, and you visualize yourself as deity. A deity is not you as a person; it's perception. So you do this very intensely, until you've almost transcended your own self-image of yourself, and you're totally identified with the perception of the deity, which sounds kind of wild and stuff, but it's really working directly with symbols. Whereas I feel that we're all unconsciously in this Christian milieu, and we're being thrown around by Christian symbols somehow.
Because we're not just unconscious Christians, we're unconscious Cartesians.
Also,
right?
yeah, two-world.
Yeah,
we're trapped in a two-world mythology as well, right? Is that
the mind, yeah, in the two worlds mythology, where there's all kinds of unconsciousnesses within us. Which was part of what I tried to unpack in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and this is part of what I mean why we just can't go back, because there isn't a single place to go back to, and there's a war within us. And what we've lost the reconciling symbol that brings those all, that explicates and deduces all of those out, and then educates them so that they can all live together the way Plato talked about, where all the parts of the soul can live in harmony. And if you can't be,
do we need that? Do we really need that? That totalizing system,
or no, it's not a totalizing system.
It's not a totalizing symbol. I mean, do we need
no,
one thing that's pulling everybody together?
No. Okay. That's not what it should be. That's not. So it's not the flag that everybody salutes in mechanical unity. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something that is constantly self-transcending itself, the way Chris was talking about, so that we are all equally all equally called to self-transcendence. So we can we can be in concert together as we self-transcend. If we can't harmoniously self-transcend with ourselves, we can't do it with each other, and vice versa. If we can't do it with each other, we can't do it with ourselves. That's the great truth of Plato's Republic. You can't separate those two together. And you need to, and what does Plato give us? He gives us mythos. He gives us coming out of the cave and returning to the cave. He gives us, right, a symbol that transcends. Like, if you think you know what the parable of the cave is, you don't know what the parable of the cave is. You go back to it again and again and again. You go back to the Gospels again and again and again. You go back to the Upanishads again and again and again. That's what I'm talking about. But we don't, what Chris's point is, we don't have that, if I'm understanding him correctly.
We don't have you don't have a coherent mythopoetic world. And we don't even, well, we seem to have many, but, and they're there, but.
And the point is, we can't rely on cultural homogeneity, what Durkheim called mechanical solidarity, like we did in the past. We all have this, right? We can't do that anymore. That's not an option for us. So we have to tap into other real power of the symbol that allows it to be a place where, right, where I want to use this term, but I have a very specific meaning for it, where we have a properly pluralistic response to the sacred that is neither relativistic nor universalistic, right? And that's why I constantly use the metaphor of evolution. There is a universal process that all life shares in, but that doesn't mean that all life is the same. In fact, the process is a process precisely by producing all this variation that continually overcomes itself and corrects itself. That's what we need right now. That's the proposal that's being made.
Sounds like India. Because there's so many different things working together simultaneously, rather than there being just one monological project.
But notice the temptation that's happening in India. There's the temptation to get a political monarchy,
of course,
a single vision on the entire country, because that's what is needed right now. This is the language we're hearing, and that is the perennial mistake. And that can either be nostalgic from the right, or it can be utopic from the left. And I think both of those are a pox on both those houses, is what I would say.
So it is this let's say perennial symbolism and stories, and which align us to a more complex and rich existence, right? It's aligned with science, I guess, being a project which is try to get it, you know. I don't know. I mean, how does science fit into that? I don't.
We thought Spinoza is, there's a reason why Spinoza is coming into prominence, and the reason why, you know, and it's been one of my great joys that my son who lives with me is taking up Spinoza in a profound way, because Spinoza offered this at the crucible of the advent of the birth of mathematical experimental science. He said, yes, but we can recover ancient scientia, and we can integrate them together. They do not have to go in opposite directions. We can actually weave them together and find a blessed life, a life that transcends the secular and the religious in a profound way. Spinoza presents the realized possibility of integrating science and scientia together. That's his project, and it's an offer for us. And he's as rigorous as he's as rigorous, if not more rigorous, than Descartes, but he is as mystical, if not more mystical, than Eckhart, right? So there is a real possibility there. There's a reason why the academic world is turning to Spinoza. I think this is there's a glowing recognition of his pertinence for our situation right now. I'm not saying, again, that we can just become Spinozist. That's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying we can learn from him in a way we need to right now.
So is he the solution to the two world mythologies? You know, the one which has many attributes.
That's exactly. Spinoza's about how to transcend the world while never leaving it. Just like you transcend yourself while never leaving it. Like, really get that. Really get that deep truth about you is also about the world. you can transcend it without ever leaving it, just like you transcend yourself without never leaving it. And those two self-transcendences deeply interpenetrate each other. That's Spinoza. And if you can get that, you can move beyond the two-world mythology without abandoning its legacy.
Mhm.
Which is why all of the same things can be true, right? Of scientific fact, descriptive scientific fact, and yet its meaning can transform utterly.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
I'm not sure
Exactly.
I get that.
Well,
Do you want?
it's that old different. Well, I mean, because you talk about sort of the mythopoetic grammar, a lot of the mythopoesis that kind of structured our idea of the cosmos has been part of the declension of that world has been as a consequence of the scientific worldview. But those two coexisted for a number of centuries before they encountered this particular modern problem. And I think that's because the way in which a scientific descriptive fact about the material world was true was not the same way in which Exodus is true. They are both true. They are simply not true by the same definition of such a thing, right? And the understanding the order of realness and how realness varies itself in what it implies, right? The two things can be real in very different ways. And I think one of the problems is that our understanding of what is real has narrowed so dramatically that it has become exclusive in what it beholds.
Yeah.
But it doesn't need to be that's not that there's no necessity to that,
And even within science, right? I was talking to one guy who said there's no such thing as science, there's sciences. I think we use science science has become a monological religious. Science says that COVID, blah blah blah, and then everybody just follows, like sheep.
There isn't even a scientific method. There are, and this is no longer controversial within the philosophy of science. There is a family, and that's a good
family of methods. Great.
A family of methods. The way you do science in astronomy is not the same way you do science in biology or the same way you do science in physics, right? They're not the same. They overlap like family members. They have family resemblances to each other and they overlap and they can communicate, but there's not a single homogeneous thing. What they share is a concern to overcome self-deception within our inferential practices and our observational practices for trying to get at reality. That's what they share. That's their family bond. But that doesn't mean, again, that they have mechanical solidarity. They have the division of labor, to use Durkheim's terminology. And that's exactly what we need now. We can't go back to mechanical solidarity religions. We have to have a division of labor spirituality, if I can put it that way.
So kind of what I'm hearing is like
proper governance. And Andrew, just this
and
the proper governance, right? Because as you say, that whole sort of follow the science, sort of sloganistic way of talking that we're hearing a lot is heedless of that very fact that there needs to be an ordering principle, a wisdom that's superordinate to the practice of science to steer it to, right? That hath steerage of its course, as it were. And that's very different.
Yeah, there needs to be wisdom.
Right.
Look, all the sort of purely medical issues aside, we need to step back. And one of the things we're not doing in the rain shadow of COVID is ask a question that Han has posed to us. Why have we turned health into our God? Right. Why have we turned physiological health into our God? When did we make that choice? And why did we make that choice? And is that the good choice to make? Why are you doing? Oh, I'm doing it for my health, my physical. Oh, well, of course. Yeah. I'm not religious, but I go to the gym 3 hours every day and blah blah blah. Like that's a God, right? And then because it's a value that, right? It is a legitimate value, and there are virtues associated with it, but it has been rendered as an absolute that is not right. And so, right. Again, I'm not taking a stand right now on all of it.
No.
What I'm trying to do is say, one of the things we need to do, one of the things we should be doing is asking, why has this become so powerful and so politicized, is precisely because we have different gods around COVID. There's there's the god of health, and then there's a god of freedom, and we've turned freedom into an absolute value too, which is also something we should step back and question. Do you really want to be absolutely free? I don't. I want my thought to be completely determined by what's true. I want my actions to be completely determined by what's good. I want my perception to be completely determined by what's beautiful. For me, freedom is not an intrinsic good. It's a purely instrumental, right? I don't see everybody has to agree with me. What I'm saying is, I can at least give you a place from which you can question the absoluteness of this value or that value. And that is what we should be doing right now in the face of this, if we want to have wisdom, as opposed to just pronouncing the science tells us to do that. That's bullshit. The science could say, well, if you want half the world to die, this is what you do, right? The science doesn't, we're not following the science. We're following the science under the god of health at all costs, right? And that's, or we reject the science because of freedom at all costs. And notice how religious that is, without it ever being brought properly into the religious arena where self-correction and wisdom are possible. We leave it in ignorance, and therefore we are imprisoned by it.
It's almost like the negative kind of paganism, isn't it? I mean,
yes, very.
Yeah.
Jonathan Pajot and I were talking about, I don't have a God. Yeah, how much time do you spend looking at your bloody screen? How much do you go to it for? It's your oracle, it's your world, it's your community, it's your virtual space, it's where you play out your myth. That's a God. Yeah. The internet is a God. Where is it? It's everywhere and it's nowhere. It's a God, and it's acting like a God in your life. And if you don't own up to that, then it's an idol. We have to all own up to this. We have to own up to the gods, right? This is almost a Gnostic thing. If we don't own up to the gods, we'll never get back to God. We'll never get back to ultimate reality, because they are the ultimate surrogates holding us back.
And they map into some very powerful archetypal forces that are
totally
prone to possess us so thoroughly that we have no concept of being possessed.
Try
that we can't account
go without your phone for a day. Go without your phone for a day and watch. Watch your anxiety go up.
We're possessed by demons also. You know, if I'm using a religious language, I'm thinking of the egregore. Do you know what that is? It's like a spirit that you create in an occult sense. And so there's all of these sort of collective spirits that are, you know, attached to our unconscious, that are guiding our behaviors in blind kind of ways.
And that is the best way to think about them, right? Like,
spirits,
it is very helpful to think about them right, just as psychology found in alchemy a very fitting symbolic grammar for understanding itself conceptually, so too is the idea of gods and spirits symbolically a very, very apposite way of understanding how wanton we can become when gripped by those kinds of influences.
Yeah.
Can I throw something in here?
Please, yeah, and perhaps we could, since you said you have an hour and a half and we have about 20 minutes left, perhaps we can start to bring in some questions and we can invite people to join in a little bit, and beginning with Owen.
Well, the chat box has been a bit quiet, so if nobody throws in a question, I might just grab someone and throw you in, so be warned. No, I'm glad this topic of the gods has come up, because this was something that I was thinking as we were going through it. So you guys have just recognized the possibility of rather unconsciously getting wrapped up in some kind of worship of an idol or possession by an archetype. At the same time, the general conversation talking about the kind of self-transcendence and Neoplatonic tradition hasn't really talked so much about working in a conscious manner, say with archetypes or with gods. In fact, when it was touched upon, if I'm connecting this right, and maybe you guys would disagree with this idea of, say, working with symbols, and Chris, what you were nodding towards is a kind of like difficulty for many people to actually wrap their heads around working with symbols. And I guess something I'm wondering is that if we don't develop that capacity, are we going to leave ourselves much more open to be possessed by these things unconsciously?
Well, can I first address the intersection? Because there was a huge development of that intersection between Neoplatonism and working with the gods. It was called theurgia, and it is a big, large part, especially post-Plotinus Neoplatonism. You see it in Proclus, and you see it in Pseudo-Dionysius, etc. So understanding what that means to work theurgically, I think is also something that has to be put into that reciprocal reconstruction. And Chris and I have endeavored to do that. We practice a version of theurgia, internal family systems theory, together for a while, and worked with exactly that. And a lot of the discussion that Chris and Andrew and I have had about the imaginal, and if you don't think Corbin is influenced by Neoplatonism and theurgia, you haven't read Corbin. And so the working with the imaginal, which again is not just the intrapsychic. The imaginal, to use one of my terms, is properly transjective. It's a transjective reality. And think about how love is both within you and without you, etc. Things like that. And so properly learning from the past, but also engineering what we need now. And there's other people that are doing this. They're working out practices for working with the shadow, working with projection, but also working with the imaginal. And so I think there is an emerging discussion between ancient theurgia, a lot of these new practices, and cognitive science that can address this concern. And I'm participating in trying to get that convergent conversation going as much as possible.
Yeah, I think the deafness that Chris was talking about is also true in terms of the blindness of our symbolic understanding. Like we're symbolically, we can't see how the symbols are affecting us, and so we need some symbolic kind of literacy or something. Understanding our dreams, for instance, which Freud and Jung picked up on, but just the need for sort of attuning ourselves to the dream world.
But there's a theory of dreams coming out of the core of machine learning.
Yeah,
right? Basically, right, that like that in deep learning, the neural network transcends itself. And how does it transcend itself? Right? It basically it unplugs from perception and then fantasizes the variation, and then the variations are put under selection.
oh wow, amazing.
What happens is the whole system evolves, and the dreaming is therefore the necessary variation that will be in dialogue with the selective attention in our waking life, and that together evolves our capacity to fit to the world. So our capacity to fit to the world is not due to our conscious or our unconscious, but their proper dialogue between them. And then of course that dialogue within has to be mirrored and amplified by the dialogue without, because we do this, we do it with other people, right? So that's what I mean about taking something that is very very closer to ancient theurgia like Jung, and that was meant as a compliment, by the way, not an insult, and then putting into dialogue with machine learning and going, oh wait, and then what does this mean for us, and what practices can we now renew or create in order to tap into that?
Mm-hmm.
That's
so the machine learning has to mirror the human.
No, that's the
wonder.
wonder.
Or has to be something totally different.
They didn't try and mirror us. They didn't. That's the wonder of it. They tried to solve a bunch of problems, and they ended up with something that mirrors us.
So that's like kind of a pattern that they discovered that is a pattern of being that works in order to find the answer to.
Well, because I've argued in print, because they were trying to, at least implicitly and then more and more explicitly, wrestle with the frame problem, wrestle with the issue of relevance realization. Mm-hmm. And then they converged with how our brain has solved the problem of relevance realization. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's the kind of convergence from independent lines of inquiry that gives you confidence in the plausibility of the proposal. But the point I'm making is, all that theory aside, notice that how a genuine, reciprocal reconstruction is now possible, and that opens up new possibilities for a new kind of theurgia for us.
And there's a certain intersection of axes that hopefully can work in a confluent way when talking about specifically this practice of dialogos. One of the things that John and I have been talking a lot about recently is how shall we say, the social dimension. I mean, one of the things that dialogos is as a function is that relationships between individuals help to inculcate and transform an individual's relationship with being itself, right? It's using the sociability of dialogue as a symbolic affordance for reconfiguring the relationality of everything, right? In a more fundamental way, right? And so the social dimension of dialogue is instrumental in a sense, right? Yes, there's communion that's important. Yes, there's sociability for its own sake, which is not unimportant, but fundamentally those are instrumental too, right? It is a relational transmutation of the way that we're confronting ourselves and knowing ourselves as well. And that's why the social dimension of dialogos, I think, has a kind of reciprocally opening. Why don't we use that? Your variation of Mark Lewis's term, John. It has a reciprocally opening relationship with that same work as applied to the interior dimension of experience, right? That's where the Jungian stuff, I think, comes in beautifully, right? Because you have, in the therapeutic context, for instance, right, you have this sort of transference, countertransference relationship that is operating, if it's working effectively, harmoniously with to use his terms for just a moment, right, the ego's confrontation with the self, right, where it has to do that kind of Copernican revolution of realizing that it's actually not at the center of its own psyche. It's actually not the center of its own being. It has to, what it has to do, it has to differentiate itself from that infinitizing side in order to confront it and reckon with it properly, so that it's not unwittingly possessed and overwhelmed by it in ways that propound the self-deception. And in the same way, what's happening when we're in the throes of meaningful dialogue is that we're using one another to actually differentiate ourselves in order that we can develop a relationship that is more integral, internal to itself.